The water did not splash, it shattered. It was a physical blow, a sudden, icy roar that didn't just coat my skin, but seemed to punch the very breath from my lungs before I could even formulate a scream. I remember the temperature first, a needle sharp, crystalline cold that turned my blood to slush and my muscles to stone. But more than the cold, I remember the weight. It wasn't the weight of the lake pressing in on me, though that was heavy enough. It was the weight of a hand, broad and calloused, clamped firmly onto the crown of my head. It was a deliberate, clinical pressure, as if he were simply steadying a lid on a jar to ensure the contents didn't spill. I looked up through the churning, silt-heavy water, my eyes stinging as the lake invaded them, and I saw him. He was a dark, jagged silhouette against the dying gold of the afternoon sun, but the detail that burned itself into my mind, the image that stayed while the rest of the world faded into a gray-green blur, was his tie. It was a vibrant, shimmering cornflower blue made of a heavy ribbed silk that caught the light even under the surface. It dangled just inches from my face, dancing in the ripples of my own frantic struggle, a mocking strip of elegance while I inhaled the metallic taste of the lake. I watched that blue oscillate, a singular point of focus as the oxygen in my blood turned to lead and the light above narrowed into a pinprick, then a flicker, then a final, suffocating nothingness. They call it a miracle that I survived. They call it a tragedy that I lost myself in those dark depths. For 20 years, I have allowed them to believe in that tragedy. Now I sit in the velvet armchair of the sunroom, a piece of furniture among furniture. The chair is a deep, bruised purple, the fabric worn thin at the armrests where my fingers, always trembling, always weak, rest with a calculated frailty. The room smells of lemon-scented floor wax and the dusty, vanilla scent of old paper from the library next door. Dust motes dance in the shafts of light that cut through the tall, leaded windows, swirling in lazy, chaotic patterns around my stillness. I am the center of their orbit, a silent sun around which their lies revolve. My nephew Julian is standing by the window, his back to me. He is speaking to a man on his cell phone, his voice loud and careless, the tone one uses when they are certain the only other person in the room is a ghost. He has his father's shoulders, broad, arrogant, and unyielding, and he wears his entitlement like a tailored suit. He treats me as if I am a part of the architecture, a crumbling gargoyle that has long since lost its ability to frighten anyone. "She's fine, Marcus," Julian says, his voice dripping with a practiced, bored impatience. He doesn't look back at me. The doctors say the cognitive decline is stable, which is just a fancy way of saying she's a vegetable in a floral print dress. We'll move her to the facility in the autumn. The estate sale is already being drafted. There's no point in keeping this mausoleum running for someone who doesn't even know what year it is. I keep my gaze fixed on a spot on the rug, a faded Persian design of interlocking vines and hidden thorns. My jaw is slightly slack, my eyes wide and unblinking, the curated mask of a woman whose mind has been hollowed out by trauma. It is a performance that requires an iron-willed resolve, a constant monitoring of every twitch, every breath, every flicker of my pupils. Inside, however, I am a vault. I am recording every word, every callous inflection, every detail of his betrayal. 20 years ago, his father, my brother-in-law, Arthur, thought he had ended me. He thought the lake had swallowed the evidence of his embezzlement and his cruelty along with my consciousness. When I was pulled from the water, blue and lifeless, and eventually blinked my eyes open in a sterile hospital room, I saw the terror in his face. He was waiting for me to point a finger. He was waiting for the accusation that would strip him of his status and his freedom. But I saw something else, too. I saw the way the family was already grieving the woman I used to be, the sharp-witted, formidable matriarch. I realized in that moment of flickering clarity that if I spoke, I would be a target. If I remembered, I would be a threat that needed to be neutralized permanently. So I chose to forget. I chose to become the frail, forgetful grandmother, a woman whose brain was a sieve. I watched Arthur live his life in a state of growing relief, watched him grow old and eventually die, never knowing that his victim had been a silent witness to his every subsequent sin. And now I watch his son. Julian thinks he has inherited a fortune and a blank slate. He thinks he is the master of this manor, disposing of the antique furniture as he sees fit. A fly lands on my hand, its tiny, translucent wings twitching. I do not flinch, I do not brush it away. I allow it to crawl over my knuckles, a test of my own discipline. Julian turns around finally, snapping his phone shut. He walks toward me, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor, a sound that used to make my heart race but now only sharpens my focus. He stops in front of me and leans down, his face inches from mine. I can smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the faint chemical scent of his cologne. Still staring at the carpet ante. He asks, his voice mocking and cruel. He reaches out and pats my cheek, a gesture that is meant to be affectionate but is instead a sharp, stinging insult. It's a shame. You were quite the lioness once, weren't you? Now you're just a rug for us to walk on. He laughs, a dry, hollow sound, and walks out of the room, leaving me in the silence of the sunroom. The dust motes continue their dance. The smell of floor wax lingers. I wait until the sound of his footsteps has faded completely, until I hear the heavy oak door of the study click shut at the end of the hall. Only then do I allow my eyes to focus. Only then do I let the trembling in my hands cease, my fingers curling into the velvet of the chair with a strength that would terrify him. I am not a rug. I am the floor, the walls, and the foundation of this house. I remember the cold water. I remember the weight of the hand. And I remember the exact shade of blue of that tie. Julian thinks he is preparing to move me to a facility, but he doesn't realize that I have been preparing too. For 20 years, I have been a ghost in my own home, but the time for haunting is over. The time for reclamation has begun. I look at the door he just walked through, my mind as sharp and cold as the lake that tried to claim me, and I begin to count the minutes until he realizes that the furniture has teeth. The door to the sunroom creaks open again, but this time the footsteps are lighter, more tentative, accompanied by the soft, rhythmic swish of expensive fabric. Alina, Julian's wife. If Julian is the blunt instrument of this operation, the heavy mallet used to shatter what remains of my dignity, then Alina is the poison hidden within a sugar cube. She floats into the room, her silhouette framed by the harsh, unforgiving afternoon light that spills through the floor to ceiling windows. She is wearing one of those oversized silk scarves she favors, a vibrant swirl of cerulean and gold that looks far too cheerful for a woman waiting for a relative to die. The fabric is draped artfully, but I know its true purpose. She uses those scarves to hide the frantic, visible thrumming of her carotid artery, a tell she's had since the day Julian brought her home. She thinks she is a master of composure, but her body betrays her every time she steps into my presence. She approaches me with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes, eyes that are constantly darting around the room, appraising the value of the silver tea service, the weight of the heavy velvet drapes, the authenticity of the oils on the wall. "Oh, Auntie," she coos, her voice a practiced melody of artificial concern, pitched in that high, infantilizing register people use for the very young or the very broken. "You look so lonely in here. Julian said you were resting, but I thought you might like some tea. A little comfort for a long afternoon." She sets the silver tray down on the low mahogany table beside my chair. The porcelain clatters, a sharp, discordant sound in the quiet room that reveals the tremor in her hands. She pours a cup, the steam rising in a lazy, fragrant curl, but she doesn't hand it to me immediately. Instead, she holds it just out of reach, her fingers clutching the delicate handle with white-knuckled intensity. I watch her through my hooded lids, maintaining the vacant, slightly bewildered expression of a woman whose thoughts have drifted far out to sea. Careful now, she whispers, leaning in so close I can see the fine, desperate lines etched around her mouth. As she reaches toward me, she tilts the cup with a practiced, subtle flick of her wrist. A splash of amber liquid lands on the back of my hand, hot and stinging. It is not an accident. I see the way her eyes narrow, the way she holds her breath, watching for a flinch, a gasp, a sudden recoil, any sign of the sharp mind she suspects still lurks beneath the surface. I do not give it to her. I remain as still as a statue, the heat of the tea soaking into my skin, though every nerve ending is screaming in protest. I allow my hand to remain limp on the armrest, a useless piece of meat. Oh, goodness me, she sighs, a long, theatrical exhale that smells of peppermint and anxiety. She dabs at my hand with a lace handkerchief, but she does it with a calculated roughness that is meant to bruise, her nails digging into my thin skin. I'm so sorry, Auntie. You've always been so clumsy lately, haven't you? It's the nerves, I suppose, or what's left of them. It's such a trial seeing you like this. I study her as she helps me, cataloging the cracks in her facade. Up close, the mask of her beauty is failing. The lines around her eyes aren't from laughter. They are the deep grooves of greed and the relentless, grinding pressure of their financial ruin. I have heard them in the dead of night, their voices drifting through the air vents like toxic smoke. I know about the second mortgage on their townhouse in the city, the one they can no longer afford. I know about the mounting credit card debts, the investments Julian made that turned out to be nothing more than a vanity project for his own ego. I have heard the hissed arguments about the lawyers, the desperation in Julian's voice when he speaks about the liquidity my death will provide. They are drowning in a sea of their own making, and they see my estate as the only life raft left. Elena stands up, tucking the soiled handkerchief back into her sleeve. Her gaze wanders to the heavy mahogany desk in the corner, the one that belonged to my husband. I know she wants to search it. She's looking for the key to the safe deposit box, the one she thinks contains the family heirloom emeralds I haven't worn in a decade. She doesn't realize that I moved them to a secure location years ago, replaced by high-quality glass that would fool any but the most expert eye. She begins to pace the room, her heels clicking rhythmically on the floorboards. She carefully avoids the third board from the radiator, the one that groans like a dying animal if you put even an ounce of weight on it. She's learned that much from her months of prowling through my house like a scavenger. But she doesn't know about the loose plank under the rug in the pantry that leads to the old servant's passage, or the way the back service stairs can be navigated in total silence if you keep your weight to the extreme left. She stops beneath the small, black dome of the security camera Julian installed last month. "For your protection, Auntie," he had said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I know its limitations perfectly. I have spent hours calculating its sweep. I know that if I sit in this specific high-backed wing chair and lean slightly to the right, I am nothing more than a static shadow in the corner of the screen. I know that the camera in the hallway has a 4-second lag when it resets its sweep, a window of time wide enough for a ghost to move through." Elena turns back to me, her face a mask of patronizing pity. "It won't be long now, Auntie. Soon you'll be somewhere much more manageable. Somewhere you don't have to worry about a thing." She leans down and kisses my forehead, her lips cold, dry, and devoid of any human warmth. Rest now, she whispers. As she walks away, I count the beats of her heart by the pulse in her neck. 1, 2, 3. She has no idea that she is the one trapped in a cage of her own making, and I am the one who holds the key. The house is no longer my prison, it is my weapon, and I know every inch of the blade. The click of the door latch is the signal for the next stage of my performance to begin. I do not move immediately. A woman in my condition does not have the mental agility for sudden transitions. I wait, letting the silence of the room settle over me like a layer of fine dust. This is the routine of the invisible, a choreography of calculated decay that I have perfected over these long, grueling months. It is an exhausting art form, requiring me to be present enough to be a witness, yet absent enough to be dismissed. I shift my gaze to the television set across the room. It is a large black rectangle, a void that reflects the room behind me. Julian rarely turns it on for me anymore, claiming the noise agitates my fragile nerves. In reality, he prefers the silence because it allows him to forget I am a sentient being. I stare into the dark glass, my eyes unfocused, my mouth slightly agape. To anyone watching through the camera, I am a flickering candle about to go out. But in the reflection of that black glass lake, I see everything. I see the hallway door, the way the light spills from the kitchen, and the shadows of my captors as they pace and plot. I have learned to read the world through reflections and echoes. When Julian enters a few minutes later, he is carrying a small plastic cup and a glass of lukewarm water. He doesn't speak at first. He stands over me, his shadow stretching across my lap like a shroud. I can smell the scotch on his breath, a mid-afternoon indulgence to steady his shaking hands. He holds out the cup containing two small, pale blue tablets. These are my vitamins, the tranquilizers intended to turn my mind into a soft, malleable mush. Time for your medicine, Auntie, he says, his voice devoid of the oily charm he uses when Alina is in the room. Here, in the privacy of my supposed dementia, he is blunt and impatient. I look up at him, my eyes swimming with a staged confusion. Is it time for the garden? I whisper, my voice cracking with a carefully practiced tremor. He sighs, a sound of profound irritation. No, Auntie, it's time for your pills. Don't make this difficult. I take the cup with a hand that I force to tremble. As I lift the pills to my mouth, I perform the most dangerous part of my daily ritual. I place the tablets under my tongue, a feat of oral gymnastics that requires absolute precision. I take a sip of the water, swallowing hard, making sure he sees the bob of my throat. He watches me with a vulture's intensity, waiting for the swallow. Once he is satisfied, he turns on his heel and leaves, the door clicking shut behind him. The moment he is gone, I lean forward, coughing into the thick, quilted sleeve of my heavy wool housecoat. This garment is my most trusted ally. It is oversized, navy blue, and lined with a dense synthetic fleece that absorbs moisture and hides a multitude of secrets. With a practiced flick of my tongue, I expel the partially dissolved, bitter tablets into the deep, reinforced seam of the cuff. Over the weeks, I have unpicked a small section of the lining, creating a hidden pocket where the medicine now resides in a gritty, chemical-smelling pile. The skin of my wrist is slightly irritated from the constant contact with the caustic residue, a small price to pay for the clarity of my mind. An hour later, the front doorbell chimes. It is a heavy, somber sound that signals the arrival of Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer. I have known Arthur Sterling for 30 years. He handled my husband's estate and once sat at my dinner table, laughing at my jokes and praising my vintage Bordeaux. Now he is the architect of my erasure. They bring him into the drawing room where I sit. Julian and Alina hover like vultures on either side of my chair. Sterling is a man who has aged poorly under the weight of his own compromises. He carries a leather briefcase that looks like it's made of dried skin. As he sits across from me, I notice the way he avoids my eyes, his gaze fixed firmly on the brass buckles of his bag. He is sweating despite the chill in the room. Fine sheen of moisture has gathered on his upper lip, and he dabs at it incessantly with a yellowed handkerchief. Arthur, I murmur, testing him. Is that you? Did you bring the peppermint? Sterling flinches. He finally looks up, but his eyes don't meet mine. They land somewhere near my left ear. Hello, Beatrice, he says, his voice thin and reedy. Her name is Bernice, Arthur, Julian interjects sharply, a warning in his tone. She's been having a very difficult morning, haven't you, Auntie? I blink slowly, letting a mask of vacancy wash over my features. Bernice, yes, that's right, I think, or is it Barbara? I see the look of triumph that passes between Julian and Alina. They think the drugs are finally eroding the last bastions of my identity. Sterling, however, looks physically ill. He pulls a sheaf of papers from his briefcase, the fraudulent documents that will sign over the remaining properties and the trust funds to Julian's guardianship. I watch his hands. They are shaking so violently that the papers rustle like dry leaves in a windstorm. He knows exactly what he is doing. He is a man who has traded his professional soul for a share of the spoils, and the guilt is manifesting as a greasy, palpable fear. We just need a few signatures. Beatrice, I mean Bernice, Sterling stammers, sliding the documents onto the low table in front of me. He produces a heavy gold fountain pen, the one I gave him for his 50th birthday. Just a formality to ensure your affairs are looked after. I lean forward, the scent of his sweat-beaded lip, a mix of stale coffee and terror, filling my nostrils. I look at the lines on the page, the complex legal jargon designed to bury me alive. I see the spaces where my name is supposed to go. I see the way Sterling's eyes dart to the security camera and then back to the floor. He cannot bear to witness the crime he is facilitating. In this moment, I realize that he is more of a prisoner than I am. He is bound by his greed and his cowardice, while I, in my madness, have never been more free. I reach for the pen, my fingers hovering over the paper, and I let a single, solitary tear track down my cheek, not out of sorrow, but out of a cold, hardening resolve. They think they are signing away my life, but they are merely providing me with the evidence I need to destroy them all. The scratching of the pen against the parchment was the only sound in the room, a dry, rhythmic rasp that felt like a blade against a whetstone. I signed my name, or a shaky, truncated version of it, across the bottom of the final page. I watched the ink bleed into the fiber of the paper, a permanent record of my supposed surrender. Arthur Sterling snatched the documents away as if they were burning his fingers, stuffing them back into the dark maw of his briefcase. He didn't offer a word of comfort or a parting glance. He simply nodded to Julian, a sharp, jerky movement of his head, and hurried from the room. I heard the front door heavy thump shut, and a moment later, the low rumble of his car engine fading into the distance. He was gone, taking my legal autonomy with him, but leaving behind the very thing he sought to bury, the truth of his own complicity. Julian and Alina didn't linger. I could sense their restless energy, a cocktail of triumph and lingering unease. They retreated to the kitchen, their voices hushed but carrying that sharp, staccato edge of people who have just committed a successful heist. I sat in my chair, the medicine still tucked safely in the seam of my housecoat, and waited. I waited for the house to settle, for the sun to dip below the horizon and the shadows to reclaim the corners of the drawing room. My mind was a cold, bright space stripped of the fog they tried to impose upon it. When the house finally fell into its nightly rhythm, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant groan of the pipes, the rhythmic clicking of the radiator, I rose. I moved with a deliberate, silent grace that would have shocked them. To them, I am a shuffling ghost, a woman whose movements are dictated by the frailty of her bones. In reality, I am a predator in my own territory. I navigated the hallway, avoiding the floorboard near the hall clock that I know moans under the slightest pressure. I reached the mudroom, where my old, heavy winter coat hung on a peg, neglected and smelling of mothballs. I reached deep into the lining of the left pocket, past the lint and the forgotten tissues, until my fingers brushed against cold, hard metal. I pulled it out, a silver locket, its surface dulled by time and the abrasive grit of the lake bed. I had found it months ago during one of those rare moments of unsupervised wandering by the shore, washed up among the reeds like a discarded memory. It was a piece of evidence they thought the water had claimed forever, a gift from my husband to me, one I had been wearing the night of the accident. To them, its disappearance was proof of my confusion. To me, its recovery was a sign from the universe that the debt must be paid. I held it in my palm, feeling its weight. It felt like a stone, cold and unyielding. I climbed the stairs, my breath even, my heart a steady, slow drumbeat in my chest. I reached Julian's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. I could hear his heavy, rhythmic snoring, the sound of a man who believes he has finally secured his future. I slipped inside. The room was suffocatingly modern, all glass and chrome and expensive, soulless art. I approached his bedside table. There, next to his designer watch and a half-empty glass of water, I placed the locket. I positioned it so the tarnished silver would catch the first rays of the morning sun. I didn't leave a footprint, didn't rustle a curtain. I was a shadow, a whisper, a glitch in their carefully constructed reality. The next morning, I was already in the breakfast nook when Julian descended. I had a bowl of untouched oatmeal in front of me, my gaze fixed vacantly on a spot just above the toaster. I heard his footsteps stop abruptly at the base of the stairs. There was a long, heavy silence. When he finally entered the kitchen, the change in him was visceral. His skin had taken on a sickly gray-green hue, the color of stagnant water or a bruise that refuses to heal. He looked aged, the arrogance stripped from his features, replaced by a raw, naked twitchiness. He moved toward the coffee maker, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. When he reached for a ceramic saucer, his hand betrayed him. The cup rattled against the porcelain with a frantic metallic chatter that echoed through the quiet room. Clatter, clack, clatter, clack. It was the sound of a man losing his grip. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He stared at the steam rising from his mug as if it contained the ghosts of his own making. Alina entered a few moments later, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Julian's trembling hands. She looked from him to me, her brow furrowed in a mixture of suspicion and irritation. Julian. What is it? You look like you've seen a specter. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing painfully in his throat. Nothing, he croaked, his voice thin and brittle. Just didn't sleep well. The wind was loud. The wind, Alina echoed, her voice dripping with skepticism. She walked over to him, her presence a cold front moving through the room. You're shaking, Julian, and you're pale. Did you take something? I said it's nothing. He snapped, the sudden volume of his voice making the coffee splash over the rim of his cup, staining the white countertop like a dark, spreading wound. The atmosphere in the house shifted in that moment. The united front they had maintained, that polished veneer of familial concern, began to show its first hairline fractures. I saw the way Alina's gaze lingered on him, a new, predatory light in her eyes. She didn't trust his silence. He didn't trust her questions. They began to look at each other not as partners, but as liabilities. They were already beginning to blame one another for the reappearance of the things they thought they had buried. They thought they were the ones in control, the architects of my demise, but as I sat there, a silent observer in the corner of my own life, I felt a deep, cold satisfaction. The first crack had formed in their arrogant foundation, and I was the one holding the hammer. The dark stain of the coffee on the white countertop spread like an ink blot, and for a moment the modern kitchen dissolved around me. The sterile smell of Julian's expensive roast was replaced by the cloying, metallic scent of wet earth and the brine of stagnant water. My mind, a vault I had kept locked for 2 decades, swung open its heavy doors, and I was no longer the silent woman in the breakfast nook. I was back on the banks of Blackwood Lake 20 years ago on a night when the moon was nothing more than a pale, sickly thumbprint behind a veil of storm clouds. The rain that night hadn't been a gentle autumn drizzle. It was a violent, driving force that turned the world into a landscape of gray and black. I remember the weight of my wool coat, soaked through and heavy as lead, pulling at my shoulders as I followed Julian and Alina down toward the water's edge. They had told me there was a problem with the boat house, some structural emergency they needed me to see before the storm worsened. I was the one with the keys, the one with the signature, the one who held the legacy they so desperately craved. Just a little further, Claire, Alina had said, her voice barely audible over the wind, yet it carried a razor-sharp edge of anticipation. She was walking behind me, her hand occasionally brushing my back, a gesture that I had mistaken for comfort but now knew was a way to gauge my balance. We reached the edge of the embankment where the ground dropped sharply into the churned-up depths of the lake. The mud was a slick, treacherous slurry beneath my boots. I remember turning to Julian, my mouth opening to suggest we go back when I saw his face. The man I had raised, the brother I had shielded from our father's temper, looked at me with a hollow, hungry desperation. "You don't deserve it," he'd hissed, the words cutting through the roar of the rain. "You sit on that mountain of gold like a dragon, Claire, while we starve in the shadows of your prudence. It was never meant to be yours alone. It's for the family, Julian," I had gasped, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm protecting it for all of us." Alina's laugh was a cold, jagged thing. "No, you're hoarding it. You're a gatekeeper who's forgotten why the gate exists." She stepped closer, her eyes glittering with a feverish light. "The accident report will say the ground gave way, a tragic slip in the dark. The grieving siblings will inherit the burden of the estate. It's poetic, really." The shove wasn't a panicked lunge. It was a calculated, forceful thrust. My feet lost their purchase on the greasy mud. I remember the frantic, useless clawing of my fingernails against the earth, the sensation of the grit embedding itself under my skin as I slid backward. Then the world inverted. The air was ripped from my lungs as I hit the water. It wasn't just cold, it was an absolute, crushing weight that sought to fill every orifice of my body. I remember the taste of the lake, silt, rot, and the bitter tang of my own terror. I looked up through the churning surface and saw their silhouettes, two dark shadows against the gray sky, watching until the ripples died down. They didn't even look away. When my consciousness finally sparked back to life weeks later in the hospital, it was like a dim bulb flickering in a vast, empty warehouse. I was encased in a cast of pain, my body a map of broken bones and internal ruptures. The smell of antiseptic was so strong it felt like it was burning the back of my throat. I couldn't move my hands, I couldn't find my voice, but I could hear. I remember the afternoon they came to my bedside, thinking I was still lost in the fog of a vegetative state. I felt the mattress dip as Alina sat near my hip. "The doctors say the cognitive damage is likely permanent," she whispered, her tone saturated with a fake, honeyed grief that made my skin crawl. "A blessing, in a way. She won't have to live with the memory of her own clumsiness." And the papers. Julian's voice was closer, near my head. He sounded jittery, the way he did this morning in the kitchen. "The power of attorney, Signed and filed, Julian. Don't be so twitchy. She's a shell. There's nothing left inside but the hum of the machines. I lay there, a prisoner in my own flesh, and felt a cold, crystalline spark of fury ignite in the center of my being. It was in that moment, while they discussed the liquidation of my assets and the tragedy of my existence, that I made the choice. I wouldn't wake up, not for them. I would play the role of the broken survivor. I would let them see the vacant stare, the trembling hands, the slow, agonizing struggle to relearn the simplest tasks. I would be the ghost haunting their feast, a constant, silent reminder of a crime they thought they'd gotten away with. I spent years in the dark, rebuilding my mind in total secrecy, turning my recovery into a weapon that I sharpened every single day behind a mask of hollow-eyed confusion. They never thought I'd remember. They never thought I was still in here, counting every debt, waiting for the perfect moment to collect. I blinked, the kitchen coming back into focus. Julian was still staring at the spilled coffee, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes still fixed on that spot above the toaster, and let a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touch the corner of my mouth. The water had been cold, but my patience was colder. Julian, I murmured, my voice a thin, reedy thing that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. It wasn't the voice of the woman who used to command boardrooms, but it was the perfect camouflage. He didn't look up from the dark, cooling pool of coffee on the counter, his shoulders hunched as if he were bracing for a blow that hadn't landed yet. I didn't wait for a response. I simply turned, the soles of my orthopedic slippers whispering a rhythmic, shuffling song against the polished hardwood as I drifted toward the back of the house. I didn't head for the sunroom or the garden where I usually sat to watch the birds. Instead, I let my feet carry me toward the heavy oak door of his private study, my hand already reaching out to push it open with a slow, agonizing creak that I knew would set his nerves on edge if he were listening. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, expensive leather, and the metallic, sour tang of a man who was working far too hard to keep a rotting foundation from collapsing. Julian was there, having beat me to the room by a side door hunched over his mahogany desk. He didn't hear me enter at first. He was too busy frantically shoving a stack of bank statements and black bound ledgers into a drawer. My eyes, which he and Alina believed were clouded by the permanent fog of neurological static, were actually as sharp and predatory as a hawk's. I stood in the doorway, my head tilted at a vacant, inquisitive angle and focused on the thick lenses of his spectacles. The light from his dual monitors hit the glass at a perfect angle, turning his eyewear into two concave mirrors. In the reflection, I didn't just see the blue-white glow of the screen, I saw the keystrokes. I watched the frantic, clumsy rhythm of his fingers as he typed. VERITAS 1984. The irony of the password truth was almost enough to make me break character and laugh. He had used his birth year and a word he couldn't define if his life depended on it. I committed the sequence to my memory, filing it away in the pristine, organized library of my mind where I kept all their sins. Barnaby, I called out, my voice trailing off into a confused, high-pitched whimper. I stepped further into the room, my gaze wandering aimlessly over the floor to ceiling bookshelves, never landing on the documents he was so desperate to conceal. Barnaby, here, Kitty. He's under the desk, Julian. He's hiding again. Julian spun around, his face a mask of twitchy irritation. His skin looked sallow in the morning light, the pores around his nose enlarged and greasy. Claire, for God's sake, you know there's no cat. Barnaby has been dead for 6 years. You were there when we put him in the ground behind the carriage house. I let my lower lip tremble, a performance I had perfected in the hospital mirror. I clutched my knitting basket tighter against my hip, the wicker creaking under the pressure. Inside that basket, nestled deep beneath a half-finished, lumpy cardigan of charcoal wool, were the small, rectangular tins of gray modeling clay I'd salvaged from the old nursery supplies. I had spent months fumbling with my keys in the hallway, dropping them with a clatter, letting them vanish into the depths of my bag or the dark crevices of the sofa. In reality, I had been pressing them into the soft, yielding surface of the clay during those long, silent afternoons when they thought I was napping. I had a perfect mold of the master key to the wine cellar, the key to the garden gate, and most importantly, the small silver key to the fireproof box Julian kept in the bottom drawer of this very desk. A soft touch on my elbow made me start, though I made sure the jump looked like the nervous, exaggerated, startled response of a brain-damaged child. It was Sophia, the young maid they'd hired last spring. She was barely 20, with hair the color of roasted chestnuts tucked neatly under a white cap and a face that still held the soft roundness of youth. She was the only person in this house of vipers who looked at me with genuine, heartbreaking pity. When she took my arm, her touch wasn't the rough, impatient shove Alina used. It was tender, as if she were afraid I might shatter like heirloom porcelain. "Come away now, Miss Clare," Sophia whispered, her voice a soothing balm. "The cat is outside, I'm sure of it. Let's go find him in the garden." As she began to lead me out, I looked back at Julian. He was already turning back to his screen, his hand shaking as he reached for a glass of scotch that was far too full for 10 o'clock in the morning. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of conflict as I looked at Sophia's kind profile. She was innocent. She was just a girl from the village trying to send money back to her mother, caught in the gravity of a family imploding. If I brought this house down and I intended to burn it to the waterline, she would be caught in the draft. I could protect her. I could find a way to usher her out before the final blow. But as we reached the hallway, I realized that her kindness was the very tool I needed. She was the only one they didn't suspect of having an agenda. I leaned into her, letting my weight sag against her shoulder, and allowed my breath to ghost against her ear in a conspiratorial hiss. "He's hiding, Sophia," I whispered, my eyes wide and fixed on the shadows in the corner of the ceiling. "The man from the water, he followed me home. He's in the walls now. Don't you hear him scratching at night? He wants his money back." I felt the way Sophia stiffened, a shiver running through her small frame. She didn't dismiss me. She didn't laugh. She looked at the dark wood paneling of the hallway with a sudden, flickering doubt. She would tell the cook. The cook would tell the gardener. By dinner, the help would be whispering about the ghosts Claire was seeing, and the seeds of a very real, very tangible paranoia would begin to sprout in Julian's already fractured mind. I let her lead me away, a docile, broken woman, while in the silent theater of my mind, I began to turn the key in the first of many locks. The sunroom was a cage of glass and heat that afternoon, the air thick with the scent of overwatered ferns and the metallic tang of the silver polish Sophia had been using before Julian dismissed her. I sat in my usual wicker chair, my hands moving with a clumsy, simulated rhythm as I tangled the charcoal yarn into a series of useless knots. Alina was there, pacing the perimeter of the room like a tethered cat, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven staccato against the checkered marble. She looked haggard. The elegant, sharp lines of her face had begun to sag under the weight of a week's worth of sleepless nights, and the foundation she'd applied so liberally was settling into the fine cracks around her mouth, making her look like a porcelain doll left too close to a fire. "Julian is late," she snapped, more to herself than to me. She stopped by a large monstera plant, her fingers nervously shredding a leaf. "He's always in that office. He's hiding things, Claire. Do you hear him?" "Does he talk to you when I'm not in the room?" I looked up at her, my eyes wide and swimming with a manufactured vacancy. I let a small, lopsided smile drift across my face. He talks to Isabel mostly, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Alina froze. The name Isabel was a ghost she hadn't expected to encounter today. Julian's first wife, the woman whose portrait had been relegated to the attic years ago, the woman whose very memory Alina had tried to scrub from the stone of this house. "What did you say?" she hissed, stepping closer, the smell of her expensive, cloying perfume mixing with the sour scent of her anxiety. "Isabel says the tea is cold," I chirped, returning my gaze to my knitting. "But Julian says it doesn't matter because you're leaving soon anyway. He told Arthur that you were becoming difficult like the others." "Who is Arthur?" she demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "Claire, look at me. Who is Arthur?" I didn't look up. I just let a single tear track down my cheek, a touch of melodrama I knew would unnerve her. "The man in the wall, Alina, or was it Julian? I get the names so mixed up since the water came into my head. He said you were looking for the little silver key, but he moved it. He put it in the place where the birds go to die." I watched from the corner of my eye as she recoiled, her hand flying to her throat. I had spent weeks planting these tiny, jagged seeds of doubt. To Julian, I whispered that Alina was seen talking to the lawyers in town, that she was seen carrying a heavy suitcase to the garden shed in the dead of night. To Alina, I played the part of the fractured witness, confusing her with the women who came before her, implying that Julian was comparing them, finding her wanting, and perhaps preparing a permanent solution for her presence. The house began to feel different after that. The grand, vaulted ceilings that had once felt like an expression of their stolen wealth began to press down on them. The hallways, once wide and airy, seemed to narrow, the shadows stretching longer and darker even in the midday sun. I felt myself expanding into that darkness. While they shrank, I grew. I felt the power of my silence, the weight of every forgotten memory I dangled before them like a lure. That night I retreated to my room but stayed huddled by the brass floor vent, my ear pressed against the cold metal. The house acted as a giant stethoscope, carrying their discord from the master suite directly to me. "I saw the way you looked at her." Alina's voice was a jagged blade cutting through the silence. "You think I'm stupid. You're talking to her about Isabel. You're telling that vegetable things about our finances." "I haven't said a word to her," Julian roared back. The sound of a glass shattering against the hearth punctuated his rage. "She's brain dead, Alina. She's a parrot repeating things she hears in her own deluded head. If she's talking about Isabel, it's because you've been spiraling and saying the name yourself. You're lying. You've always been a liar. They didn't eat dinner." The silver platters of roasted lamb and glazed carrots sat untouched on the sideboard, the fat congealing into a white, waxy film. I watched them from the doorway of the dining room, a silent specter. Julian's shirt was rumpled, his tie discarded, his collar stained with sweat. He looked sallow, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with deep purple hollows. He looked at me then, his fork trembling in his hand, and for a second the veil of his arrogance dropped. He didn't see a victim. He didn't see the sister-in-law he'd successfully robbed and lobotomized with neglect. He saw something else. He saw a mirror reflecting his own mounting madness. A flicker of genuine, unadulterated fear sparked in his pupils, a realization that the broken thing in the room was the only one who truly knew the architecture of the trap they were in. He looked at me as if he suspected, for the very first time, that the lights were on behind my eyes and someone was home, watching him fail. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a challenge. I simply let my jaw slacken, tilted my head to the side, and let a bit of saliva pool at the corner of my mouth. I gave him a vacant, wide-eyed smile, the kind a child gives to a stranger, and watched the fear in his eyes turn into a desperate, sweating confusion. I turned away, the heavy silk of my robe whispering against the floorboards, feeling the house groan around us, ready to collapse under the weight of the secrets I was finally ready to exhale. The sky outside my window didn't just darken, it bruised, turning a violent, necrotic shade of purple gray that signaled the arrival of the season's first true gale. I stood by the glass, watching the ancient oaks on the perimeter of the estate whip their limbs in a frantic skeletal dance. The wind began to howl through the eaves, a low, mournful sound that the house seemed to answer with its own groans and pops. This was the overture I had been waiting for. The atmosphere in the manor had become so thick with Julian and Alina's mutual suspicion that it felt like a physical weight, a pressure behind the eyes that only a storm of this magnitude could hope to break. I could feel the electricity in the air, the sharp, metallic scent of ozone bleeding through the cracks in the window frames, and it energized me. For the first time in 20 years, my joints did not ache. My mind was a singular, sharpened point of light in the gathering gloom. I turned away from the window and moved toward the heavy oak armoire that had sat in the corner of my room since the day I was brought back here, broken and supposedly hollowed out. They had never bothered to move it. It was too heavy, and they assumed I lacked the strength or the wit to use it for anything other than storing my drab, shapeless sweaters. With a strength that would have terrified them, I knelt and pressed my fingers into a specific knot in the floorboards beneath the cabinet's carved feet. The wood gave way with a satisfying, muffled click. From the dark hollow, I withdrew the box. It was a simple thing of cedar and iron, but to me it felt as heavy as a sarcophagus. I carried it to my bed and sat, my hands trembling not with weakness, but with a terrifying, cold anticipation. I opened the lid. The scent of old parchment and dried lavender wafted up, the smell of a life they thought they had successfully cremated. I ran my fingers over the edges of the original deeds to the estate, the ones Julian believed had been lost in the accidental fire at the solicitor's office 2 decades ago. I had been faster than his flames. I felt the crisp, embossed seal of my father's true will, the one that named me the sole executor and heir, leaving Julian with nothing but a modest stipend contingent on my goodwill. He had burned a forgery that night. I had watched him do it from the shadows, cradling this box to my chest like a child. Beneath the papers lay the most damning evidence of all, the recorded confessions. Not digital files which could be erased or corrupted, but the handwritten journals of the nurse they had hired to oversee my recovery in those first hazy years, a woman whose conscience had eventually outweighed Julian's bribes. She had documented every forced sedation, every whispered threat Julian made into my ear while I was paralyzed by drugs, every cent he had funneled from my accounts into his failing shell companies. She was dead now, but her handwriting remained steady and clinical, a voice from the grave that would scream louder than the wind outside. I began my ritual. I stripped away the moth-eaten cardigan and the stained housecoat that had served as my shroud for 20 years. Beneath them, I was thinner than I had been, my skin pale as parchment, but my muscles were taut. From the bottom of the cedar box, I pulled out my mother's jewelry, the pieces they thought I had sold or lost in my confusion. There was the heavy gold chain with the emerald pendant, the stones as green and cold as a serpent's eye. I fastened it around my neck, the metal freezing against my collarbone. I slipped the diamond bands onto my fingers, the carats catching the flickering light of the storm's lightning. These were not mere ornaments, they were my armor. Underneath the dowdy, oversized robe I donned to maintain the charade for one last hour, the jewelry felt like a secret fire against my skin. I sat on the edge of the bed, the box resting in my lap, and let the calmness wash over me. It was the absolute, terrifying stillness of a predator that has spent 20 years scenting the air, marking the habits of its prey, and waiting for the exact moment when the stars and their sins aligned. Julian and Alina were downstairs now, trapped by the rain and their own escalating vitriol, fueled by the ghosts I had invited into their breakfast nook. They thought they were fighting each other for control of a crumbling empire, never realizing that the empire had already been reclaimed by the ghost in the attic. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. I didn't see the poor, dear Claire they mocked. I saw a woman who had survived a psychological war of attrition. I saw a woman who had remembered every slight, every theft, and every moment of calculated cruelty. The storm rattled the glass, a thunderclap shaking the very foundations of the manor, and I smiled. It was time to go downstairs. It was time to stop being the memory and start being the reckoning. The weight of the box in my hands was no longer a burden. It was the stone I was about to drop into the fragile glass house they had built atop my life. I stood up, the silk of my hidden finery whispering against my legs, and walked toward the door. The hunt was over, the kill was all that remained. I moved down the grand staircase with a calculated frailty, my hand trembling as it gripped the mahogany banister. Each step was a performance, a deliberate mimicry of the broken woman they believed they had created. Beneath the heavy, moth-eaten wool of my robe, the emerald pendant pressed a cold, sharp kiss against my skin, a secret weight that anchored me to my purpose. I could hear them in the drawing room, the sharp, jagged edges of their voices cutting through the low hum of the storm. Julian was pacing. I could tell by the rhythmic, impatient strike of his heels against the hardwood. When I reached the doorway, I lingered in the shadows for a heartbeat, watching him. He looked haggard, his expensive silk shirt damp with perspiration, his eyes darting toward the window as if he expected the very walls to close in on him. Alina was hunched over a crystal glass, her knuckles white, her face a mask of bitter resentment. They were vultures fighting over a carcass that wasn't as dead as they thought. Julian, I whispered, my voice thin and reedy, a ghost of a sound that barely carried across the room. He spun around, his face contorting into a mask of feigned concern that didn't quite reach his panicked eyes. Claire, what are you doing out of bed? You should be resting, he said, his voice tight with the strain of his own crumbling deceptions. I leaned against the doorframe, letting my head loll slightly to the side. I remembered Julian, the rain, it brought it back. I remembered where father put the cash, the gold he took from the safe before the solicitors arrived, the rainy day fund he always joked about. The change in him was instantaneous. The faux concern vanished, replaced by a raw, naked avarice that made his features sharpen into something predatory. He took a step toward me, his breath hitching. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask how I remembered. He only saw the salvation of his mounting debts. The gold, where did he hide it? The boathouse, I murmured, clutching my robe tighter. Under the loose floorboards in the back corner, I saw him, Julian. I saw him through the window when I was a girl. I think I can find it. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, barely glancing at Alina, who had stood up, her eyes wide with a mix of suspicion and sudden hope. Stay here, he snapped at her. I'll handle this. He turned back to me, his hand gripping my arm with a strength that was far from gentle. Show me, now. We stepped out into the night, the storm greeting us with a violent gust of wind that whipped my hair across my face. The woods were a labyrinth of shadows and slick black mud. I led the way, my movements slow and stumbling, forcing him to keep pace with my feigned weakness. The path to the lake was overgrown, the branches of the ancient oaks reaching down like skeletal fingers to snag at our clothes. Behind me, I could hear him, the heavy, wet thud of his boots and his breathing. It was a sound I will never forget, a thick, greedy panting, the sound of a man who could already feel the weight of the coins in his hands. He was so close that I could smell the stale scotch on his breath and the scent of his desperation, a sour, metallic tang that cut through the smell of the damp earth. He kept prodding me, his hand frequently shoving at my shoulder to keep me moving, his impatience radiating off him in waves. He was no longer a brother, he was a scavenger, and I was the map to his prize. As we reached the edge of the water, the dilapidated boathouse loomed out of the mist like a rotting ribcage. The structure groaned under the assault of the wind, the wood silvered and gray with decades of neglect. The smell of the lake hit us, then stagnant water, rotting algae, and the pervasive, suffocating scent of damp timber. I stepped onto the rickety dock, the boards complaining loudly under our weight. Julian was right on my heels, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the moss-covered planks. We entered the structure, and the darkness swallowed us, save for the rhythmic flashes of lightning that illuminated the skeletal remains of an old skiff and the cobwebs hanging like funeral veils from the rafters. Julian pushed past me, his eyes frantically scanning the floor. Where, which corner? He demanded, his voice echoing off the corrugated tin roof. He dropped to his knees, his expensive trousers soaking up the filth of the floor, his fingers clawing at the wood. He was frantic, a man possessed, his breathing coming in ragged, guttural gasps as he began to rip at the rotted boards. I stood in the shadows near the doorway, watching his total descent into madness. I felt the slouch in my shoulders evaporate. I felt the decades of forced docility shed away like a dead skin. I drew myself up to my full height, the emerald at my throat glowing in a sudden flash of lightning, my mother's rings biting into my fingers as I clenched my fists. The transformation was internal as much as it was physical. The cold, sharp clarity of my mind finally synced with my body. Julian let out a frustrated growl, his hands bleeding from splinters. "There's nothing here. Claire, you useless bitch, where is it?" He turned, still on his knees, ready to lash out, but the words died in his throat. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 20 years, he truly saw me. I wasn't the broken, stuttering shell he had spent 2 decades gaslighting. I stood tall, my head held high, the authority of my lineage radiating from me like a physical heat. The flickering light caught the diamonds on my hands and the cold, hard emerald at my neck, the jewels he thought were long gone. I spoke then, and my voice did not shake. It was the voice of the woman who owned the ground he knelt upon, resonant and terrifyingly calm. "Stand still, Julian. The performance is over, and the master of the house has finally returned to collect her dues." The silence that followed my words was heavier than the storm outside, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the very air from Julian's lungs. He stayed on his knees, his hands still buried in the muck and splinters of the floorboards, but his body had gone rigid. The lightning flashed again, a jagged white vein across the sky, and in that strobe light clarity, I saw the exact moment the gears of his mind seized. The confusion, the denial, and finally, the cold, gut-wrenching terror of a man who realizes the prey he's been tormenting is in fact the hunter. "Claire," he whispered, and the name sounded like a prayer to a god he didn't believe in. His voice was thin, reedy, stripped of the booming arrogance he'd used to command the hallways of our family home. "What are you? What is this?" I stepped forward, the silk of my robe whispering against the rough wood. Each movement was deliberate, a reclaiming of my own physical space. I didn't look like a woman who forgot her own name. I looked like the mistress of the estate, the rightful heir to every stone and shadow of this place. I watched his eyes track the emerald at my throat. He knew that stone. He knew its weight, its history, and the fact that it should have been locked in a vault he'd claimed was empty years ago. The boathouse was always your favorite place to hide things, wasn't it, Julian? I said, my voice cutting through the drumming rain on the tin roof. Small things at first: stolen cigarettes, the keys to father's study, the letters from the girl in town you'd ruined. You thought the rot here would swallow your secrets. You thought the lake would keep your silence. He tried to stand, his knees wobbling, his expensive wool coat smeared with the black, oily filth of the floor. He looked small. It was a physical transformation that defied logic. He was a large man, yet against the backdrop of the rising lake waters and the yawning darkness of the boathouse, he seemed to shrink, his shoulders hunching as if to protect his vitals. "You're sick, Claire," he stammered, his hand reaching out as if to steady himself on a ghost. "The doctors said the medication, you're having an episode. Let's just get you back to the house. We can talk about this when I'm what? Drugged, docile, compliant." I took another step, pinning him against the back wall where the wood was softest with decay. "I've been waiting for this night for 20 years, Julian. 20 years of watching you play the grieving brother while you picked the meat from my bones. I remember the night our father died. I remember the way you stood over his bed, not with tears, but with a calculator in your eyes. And I remember the lake." The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, translucent gray. He looked like a corpse that had been pulled from the very depths he'd tried to consign me to. "I don't know what you're talking about," he hissed, but his eyes were darting toward the door, calculating the distance, the effort it would take to shove an old woman aside. "You do," I said, and now I used my voice like a scalpel. I didn't need to shout, I needed to dissect. I began to peel away the layers of his life, one lie at a time. It was August. The air was so thick you could taste the salt from the coast. "You took me out on the skiff. You told me we were going to look at the lilies, but you kept rowing until the shore was just a smudge of green on the horizon. You talked about the debt. You talked about how father had left everything to me because he knew you'd gamble it away within a year. You were so calm, Julian. That was the most terrifying part. You weren't angry. You were just efficient." I watched him flinch as I described the sensation of the boat rocking. I described the way he'd reached out, not to steady me, but to tip the balance. I described the cold shock of the water, the way it rushed into my lungs, and the sight of him, standing in the boat, silhouetted against the moon, watching me sink with the same detached curiosity one might show a drowning insect. "You thought the trauma would wipe the slate clean," I continued, my words slicing through his pathetic attempts to interrupt. "And for a while it did. The brain is a kind thing, Julian. It hides the sharpest edges to keep us from bleeding out. But the water didn't kill me, and the senility was a fortress, not a prison. I sat in that chair for 2 decades, watching you sell off the silver, watching you lie to the lawyers, watching you treat me like a piece of furniture while you bled our legacy dry. I heard every whispered conversation. I saw every forged signature. I was the ghost in your house, Julian, and I've seen everything." He collapsed back against the rotting timber, a strangled sound escaping his throat. He realized then that there was no money under the floorboards. There was no hidden stash of gold. There was only me, the witness he'd failed to eliminate. "Claire, please," he choked out, his hands coming up in a submissive, shaking gesture. "I can make it right. The money, I still have some of it. I can give you everything. I'll leave. I'll sign over the deeds, the accounts, everything I've managed to keep. We don't have to involve the police. Think of the family name. Think of Elena." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a wave of profound disgust. He was offering me paper. He was offering me the very currency he'd used to buy his way out of a conscience. "You think your money has value to me?" I asked, my voice dripping with a cold, crystalline contempt. "You stole 20 years of my life, Julian. You stole my youth, my sanity, and the chance to ever feel safe in my own skin. You think a few stacks of stolen bills can pay for the sound of the water closing over my head. You think you can bargain for your soul with the very coins you took from a dead man's eyes. I moved closer until I could smell the terror coming off him in waves, a sour, metallic scent that drowned out the rot of the lake. I lined in, my face inches from his, my eyes boring into his soul with the weight of 2 decades of silent judgment. Your money is worthless, I whispered, the words a final, killing blow. Just like you're not a brother, you're not a man, you're just a coward waiting for the tide to come in. And Julian, the tide is finally here. The lights cut through the fog first, long fingers of clinical blue and urgent red that swept across the peeling bark of the oaks like searchlights seeking out a fugitive. I didn't turn to look back at Julian. I didn't need to see the way his knees finally gave out, the way he slumped against the damp, moss-slicked timber of the old boathouse like a discarded marionette whose strings had been severed by a single sharp truth. I simply turned my back on him and walked toward the light. My gait was steady, no longer the shuffling, hesitant step of the woman they thought they'd broken, but the purposeful stride of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own shadow. As I reached the gravel driveway of the estate, the scene was already unfolding with a surgical, cold precision. Mr. Sterling, the solicitor who had been my ghost writer and legal anchor for the past 6 months, stood by the lead patrol car. He looked exactly as he had in our clandestine video calls, sharp, impeccably dressed in a charcoal overcoat that defied the dampness, and utterly devoid of the cloying pity everyone else had showered upon me for years. He nodded once, a gesture of professional acknowledgement that felt more like a hard-won accolade than any get-well card I'd received in 2 decades. He knew what this had cost me. He knew the endurance it took to play the fool while the wolves circled the dinner table. Then came the spectators. In a small, insular town like this, a police siren is a dinner bell for the bored, the curious, and the judgmental. I saw them huddled at the edge of the property line, their silhouettes blurred by the mist. Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down was there, her silk robe clutched tightly at her throat, her face a mask of horrified, rapt fascination. Beside her stood the Miller brothers, the very men Julian had shared expensive, peat-heavy scotch with while discussing the heavy burden of my ongoing care. They watched as the officers moved past them, their faces pale and drawn under the flickering streetlights. They had all been part of the theater, the unwitting audience to my supposed decline, and now they were witnessing the final act of a play they hadn't realized was a tragedy for the villains, not the victim. I saw the moment the realization hit them that the poor senile Claire they had discussed in hushed, patronizing tones was the one standing tall, while the pillar of the community was being brought out in shadows. Elena was the first to be escorted from the house. She wasn't the poised, elegant hostess who had curated our social ruin with such practiced grace. She was a screeching, frantic mess of blonde hair and expensive silk. 2 female officers had her by the arms, and she was thrashing with a raw, ugly violence that shocked even the neighbors who thought they knew her. "It's a mistake, it's all a mistake," she screamed, her voice cracking and echoing off the stone walls of the manor like the cry of a trapped bird. "She's crazy. Claire is insane. She made it all up. Ask anyone, ask the doctors." She looked toward Mrs. Gable, pleading with her eyes for a witness to my madness, but the old woman looked away, her eyes fixed firmly on the black, polished boots of the officers. Elena's facade didn't just crack, it pulverized into dust. She began to wail, a high-pitched, animalistic sound that scraped against the night air, her designer heels dragging through the mud as they forced her toward the transport van. Julian followed minutes later, emerging from the side path by the lake. He was the chilling opposite of his wife. He walked in a vacuum of absolute silence, his hands cuffed behind his back, his head bowed as if the weight of the atmosphere had suddenly tripled. He didn't look at the neighbors. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked like a man who had finally seen the bottom of the lake and realized he was still down there, drowning. When his eyes finally met mine across the driveway, there was no anger left, no calculation, no more lies to tell. There was only a hollow, echoing void. He had spent his life thinking I was a ghost he could haunt. He never realized he was the one being haunted by the truth I had refused to forget. Inside, the house was being picked apart by a team in windbreakers marked forensics. I stood in the foyer, watching as Detective Vance and his team cataloged the wreckage of 20 years of greed. I saw them pull the black leather ledger from the false bottom of the mahogany desk in the library, the book where Julian had meticulously, arrogantly recorded every cent he'd siphoned, every forged signature, every discretionary fee paid to keep the local doctors looking the other way. They found the locket, too, the one he'd told me was lost at sea the day of the accident, the one that held our mother's portrait and the small, folded confession our father had written on his deathbed, which Julian had stolen before the ink was even dry. But the most damning evidence was the digital trail. I pointed the technician toward the grandfather clock in the hall and the heavy, ornate brass lamps in the library. From within their casings, they pulled the tiny, high-fidelity recording devices I had spent months hiddenly installing, moving them an inch at a time during the hours when the house was asleep and I was supposed to be lost in a dreamless stupor. I had hundreds of hours of them, Julian and Alina laughing about my dementia over breakfast, discussing the final sale of the North acreage, and most chillingly, the quiet, casual way they talked about speeding up the process with my medication once the last of the liquid assets were secured. As the last car door slammed and the sirens faded into a dull, rhythmic throb in the distance, the neighbors began to disperse, whispering into their palms and casting long, guilty looks back at the house. I stood on the porch, the air finally clear of the metallic, sour tang of Julian's fear. Then the rain started. It wasn't a storm, but a soft, steady, cleansing downpour that felt like a baptism. It washed the mud from the driveway and the lingering scent of Julian's expensive cologne from the foyer. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of wet earth and ozone. The house was silent now, but it wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a clean slate. I was 70 years old, and for the first time in 2 decades, I was the only person living inside my own head. I walked back inside, not to the padded chair in the corner, but to the head of the long oak table, and I sat in the stillness, listening to the rain wash the world away. The silence that followed the departure of the sirens was not the hollow, terrifying vacuum I had lived in for so long. It was a heavy, velvet curtain that had finally fallen on a play I never wanted to star in. I remained at the head of the oak table for a long time, my hands resting flat against the cool, polished grain. For 20 years, these hands had trembled on command. I had forced them to shake when I reached for a teacup, a calculated display of frailty that fed Julian's ego and Alina's contempt. Now they were as still as the stone foundations of the manor itself. I felt the weight of my own skin, the reality of my bones, and the sharp, piercing clarity of a mind that no longer had to hide behind a veil of confusion. The performance was over. The stage was empty, and I was the only one left to take the bow. I rose from the chair, my movements fluid and intentional. The Claire who shuffled, the Claire who tripped over rugs and stared blankly at walls, had vanished into the damp night air along with the police cruisers. My knees ached, a genuine ache of 70 years, not the exaggerated agony I'd used to lure them into complacency. but it was a grounding pain, a reminder that I was very much alive. I walked toward the mahogany sideboard, my footsteps echoing with a newfound authority on the hardwood floors. I reached for the heavy crystal decanter, the one Julian had always kept filled with a 25-year-old single malt, a bottle he considered far too complex for my supposed infantile palate. The glass felt substantial in my hand, the etched patterns biting softly into my palm. I poured a double measure, watching the amber liquid swirl and catch the low light of the foyer's dim lamps. The scent hit me first: peat, sea salt, and a hint of dried orange peel. It was the smell of wealth, yes, but also of endurance. I took a sip, letting the initial bite of the alcohol sear my tongue before the warmth bloomed in my chest. It was a sophisticated, punishing flavor, and I savored it, standing there in the middle of the room like a conqueror surveying a reclaimed territory. There was no one to tell me I'd had too much, no one to helpfully suggest a glass of warm milk instead, and no one to lace my drink with the sedatives that had turned my world into a gray, featureless fog for 2 decades. I moved to the hearth in the great room. The ashes from the morning were cold, a gray reminder of the life Julian had tried to burn away. I knelt, my joints popping in the quiet, and began to build a fire. I didn't call for a servant. I didn't wait for a kind hand to assist the poor, confused woman. I struck the match myself, watching the sulphurous flare ignite the kindling. The smell of dry cedar and wood smoke began to fill the room, a rustic, honest scent that pushed back the lingering, cloying perfume Alina had worn like a weapon. As the flames took hold, casting long, dancing shadows against the tapestries, I sat in the high-backed wing chair, the one Julian had claimed as his throne. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, listening to the house breathe. Without the constant, underlying thrum of their presence, the clacking of Alina's designer heels, the low, condescending hum of Julian's voice, the sound of drawers being rifled through in the search for things that didn't belong to them, the manor felt different. It felt expansive. It felt like it was remembering me, too. I thought of the sunroom, that bright, glass-walled prison where they had parked me like a piece of unwanted furniture. I would never sit there again. I thought of the lake, its dark waters no longer a threat but a secret keeper that had finally given up its ghosts. I had been the victim of the water and the prisoner of the sun, but tonight I was simply the master of the flame. The price of this victory was high. I was not naive enough to ignore the cost. I had spent the twilight of my life playing a part, sacrificing decades of genuine connection and dignity for the sake of a long-game revenge. I had watched my own reflection wither, pretending not to recognize the woman looking back. I stood up and walked toward the gilded mirror that hung in the hallway, the one that had witnessed every staged meltdown and every faked lapse in memory. I stood before it now and looked. The woman in the glass was old, yes. Her hair was a shock of silver, her face a map of lines earned through both grief and silence. But her eyes, they were a revelation. They were sharp, intelligent, and terrifyingly lucid. There was no fog in them, no feigned vacancy. They were the eyes of a general who had won a war of attrition. I reached up and touched my cheek, tracing the ridge of my jaw. I saw the strength there, the steel that had remained unbroken even when I was being told, day after day, that I was nothing more than a fading shadow. I acknowledged the pain of the past, the way they had tried to bury me while I was still breathing, but I also saw the future. It was a smaller future than the one I had imagined as a girl, perhaps, but it was mine. It was unburdened by their lies, their greed, and the suffocating weight of their expectations. I walked back to the table where a single candle flickered in a silver holder. The rain outside had slowed to a rhythmic dripping from the eaves, a peaceful, ticking clock marking the start of my new life. I looked at the candle, the small flame dancing in the draft, a tiny, defiant spark in the vast, dark house. I felt a profound sense of self actualization, a settling of the soul that I hadn't felt since before the accident. I was Claire. I was the woman who remembered everything. I was the woman who had survived the wolves by becoming the forest. I lined in, the warmth of the flame brushing against my skin one last time. With a single, steady breath, I blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward in the dark, a thin, gray ribbon of the past dissolving into the night. I stood in the absolute silence, unafraid, and finally I was home. If you like this story, please subscribe. Thanks.